Okay, so there's a few questions I have you consider when you walked in here. At first glance, that seems like it should be an easy question, right? You have been in school for how many years, and you've had science for how many of those years? So when we say, what is science? There should be at least some things that spring to mind. Stuff you've done, stuff you've learned. And I'm kind of curious to hear what a few of you have to say about that. So, Avery, what did you put for what is science? Experimenting. Okay, there's definitely some experimenting that goes on in science. Okay, your sister's not here yet. She's not here. She's not here. Kason, what did you put for what is science?
The study of many things.
The study of many things. I like that. There's definitely some study involved there. One or two more here. Barrett, how about you?
I said science is the study of living and non-living.
Study of living and non-living things. There's definitely different categories of stuff to study. Okay. Let's go one more here. Braden, what'd you put? Doing experiments? Okay. So the study of living and non-living things, the study of many things, etc. What sets science apart from any other class, any other kind of study, like mathematics or social studies? More hands-on stuff, that's part of it, certainly. What if we were to broaden it outside of, when you think science, you think a class, but think beyond just a class. When we start talking about what science is, be thinking about that. Second question, well, how does science work? As if it's a thing, there has to be some kind of process to it. Alyssa, what'd you put? Works in many different forms, such as chemical reactions. Okay. Axel, how about you?
By studying it.
By studying it. No, there's definitely some study involved there. Michaela, what'd you put for how does it work?
Hands-on.
Hands-on. Okay. I hope so. As okay, reacting to certain things. Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of questions that have to do with, something being hands-on, something being active. I'm hearing specifically a lot of stuff having to do with probably what your picture of chemistry is, of, chemicals and reactions. And all of that's pretty good. Josh, what do you think about how does science work?
You mix things.
Mix things. Okay. Definitely some of that involved. So what I'm getting so far is that science involves studying living and non-living things. It's hands-on. It's active. You mix things. So if somebody is like a quote-unquote scientist, whether they get paid to do it or whether they do it in their free time, is all that they do read about stuff that people have already done and then mix things together, or is there more to it than that? Say what?
Big test type.
Oh, I'm so glad you used the H word, hypothesis. The hypothesis, we're going to talk a little bit about that today and among other things. I'm pretty sure there's probably a 50-50 chance that you think you know what a hypothesis is, but it's exactly the wrong thing. Okay, this is not your fault. This is because your teachers were trying to take the easy way out, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Question number 3 is a little bit more open-ended. What are some things that science can do, and what are some things that science can't do? And I guess before we get to that, if I'm studying something, why am I doing it? Or if I'm mixing stuff together and watching what happens, or if I'm testing the hypothesis, why? What's the whole purpose for that? Anybody have any ideas? Why not? To get a good grade? Okay, great. But, beyond that, why do science? Trying something new. I certain shirt on a certain day, and you notice, or you seem to notice, there are a lot more people, let's say attractive people, who seem to be checking you out that day. Now, it could just be that you're looking really good, or it could be something to do with that shirt, right? So how do you go about finding out if it's the shirt that's causing that or if it's something else that's causing that? Try wearing something different, okay? Try wearing the same shirt and then sort of observe to see if you get a similar reaction out of people, right? So what you're doing by doing that is you're trying to answer a question of some kind, correct? Does this shirt make me look super, super hot? Okay? So the reason why you are studying things, the reason why you're experimenting, the reason why you're testing hypotheses is because you've got a question that you're trying to find an answer to. Okay? You walk outside and you see that the sun is looking really kind of fuzzy and especially red this morning and at night. Anybody notice that? Okay? Anybody think, I wonder why that is? So there are some questions that maybe science can answer and stuff. So when we talk about what can it do, Alyssa, can you give me an example maybe of something science can do or a question that science could maybe help us answer? I'm sorry, or what did you put for number 3?
I said science can do a lot of things that outside our ability.
Okay, that's a little bit vague. So let me go with my other question then. So, like, what is a question that maybe science can help us to address or answer or something like that? Alyssa. Good morning, dear. Come in, come in.
Like I said, like when the sun is red, why is it so pink?
Okay, sure. Why does the sun look fuzzy and red? Okay. That's something that we could probably use the tools of science to help us answer. Thank you. Josh, what's something else that what's another question maybe science could help us answer, or what's something science can do?
It can explode.
It can explode. Okay. Be more specific.
Like if you mix something up, it'll explode or something.
Okay. All right, so I'll go with my secondary question. What's maybe a question that science can help us answer about the world around us?
What can and can't explode?
Okay, what can and can't explode? I love it. Okay. What things, when I put them together, will blow up? What are some other things that are safe to put together without exploding? Yes, that's definitely a science question. Axel, what about number 3? What can science do, or what is a question that science can help us answer? Good morning.
Why are clouds white?
Why are clouds white? That's something that we can, collect data about, we can do experiments with, and we can determine why they're white and poofy. Let's try it for one more here. Brady, what's another way, what's something science can do, or what's a question science can answer? It's kind of like falling out of a boat and hitting water. There's so many of them, you can't not get one. I can wait. How old the tree is. Okay, that's definitely a question science can answer. So, it seems like science can help us answer questions about the world around us. Whether it's something natural, like a tree, or whether it's something maybe unnatural, like mixing things together to a boom. Okay? So, are there any questions maybe that science can't help us answer? Michaela, what do you think? Are there any questions outside the power of science to help us figure out?
Probably not, because like science, like it's a matter of life, so it's kind of like everything. Like science is a big part of the world.
Okay. So you think that there's not really anything science can't do?
Well, like there is.
Okay.
I just don't know what.
All right, that's fair. That's fair. It's maybe a little bit harder to think of one. Kason, can you think of something science can't do or a question science can't answer?
Probably the way
humans act the way they act. Okay? Now, to a degree, there's probably some things science can help us answer from that, right? You guys remember studying genetics? Okay? You know how we've got a lot of predispositions to things in our genes. They're doing all kinds of research still to this day. They're finding out that certain combinations of alleles on your chromosomes can cause you to have, certain kind of temperament, or can help you to, learn a little bit easier than other folks, or, be a little more athletically inclined, or, have predispositions to getting cancer. So some of how people act, science probably can answer. Okay? But there might be some questions in there about human behavior that science can't help us with. Addie Gifford, what do you think? Are there any questions you can think of that science probably can't answer?
Not really anything that comes to mind.
Okay. We've got a couple more sticks in here. Let's see if you can. I'll just put it to hands up. Can anybody raise your hand and think of a question that science can't answer? I can think of thumbs up. Crazy.
The world ended?
Okay. How will the world end? All right. Now, science can probably put forth a few theories about, what may cause the end of, now it could be the end of human civilization, it could be the end of the Earth period. In astronomy this year, my students are studying about the life cycle of stars, which is something we touched on back in 8th grade. And how eventually our sun is going to turn into a red giant and is going to expand and actually engulf all of the inner planets. So if humans are still around when that happens, then it's going to be, goodbye for all of us and goodbye for the Earth. Anybody have any other thoughts about questions science can't answer? Yeah.
The zombie apocalypse will happen.
Will the zombie apocalypse ever happen? Actually, science might. Science might be able to look at things that have to do with what we typically think of as mindless walking zombies. Have you ever heard of the wasp that turns cockroaches into zombies? There's this wasp, and what it does is it lands on the back of a cockroach and it injects a little thing into the back of its neck, and then it can actually control this cockroach, and it can make it do what it wants to. It's almost like mind control. It can sort of touch it and stare it, and basically it drives this little cockroach right back to its nest where it lays eggs on it, and its babies wake up and eat it alive. Okay, that's almost zombie behavior. Not quite, Walking Dead or whatever. Now, what both of you talked about is, can science predict the future? And I would say yes and no. Okay, could science have predicted, a year ago that we'd all be wearing masks in high school? Probably not. But it's not without precedent. There have been other pandemics in other parts of the world, and other people have gone through the kind of thing you're going through right now several times. I've got one. What is love? Can science answer that for me? Can science tell me some things about attraction between two people? Absolutely. There's all kinds of really fascinating stuff that's been done on what is it about other people that we find attractive. Some of it has to do with facial symmetry. If you look at some of your most famous celebrities, they have very symmetrical faces. The left and right side of their face look pretty much identical. Okay, most of us don't. Science can tell us. In fact, I've read some really interesting stuff. There's this guy, I think his name's Desmond Morris, and he wrote a book called The Naked Ape. And he basically describes human beings in terms of animal behavior. Really fascinating read. Here's a question. Can science help me answer this? What happens after we die? Do we have any evidence about that? A few anecdotal stories maybe of people who have been in near-death experiences, talking about, experiencing a warm feeling or a white light. And, maybe science can help to explain away some of that stuff. But the big question of, okay, is this mortal life all there is to it, or is there more beyond the grave? That's not something science can really answer. How about, what's my purpose? Why am I here? Why do I exist? Can science answer that? Again, So when you look at science, science is a really cool tool, and science can answer a lot of questions for us. All of science has to do with taking observable phenomena, stuff we can see and hear and taste and touch and smell, and coming up with explanations for why that works. But I will submit to you that probably the most important questions out there, science can't touch. Now that means two things. One, we would be foolish to throw those questions away simply because a process of science can't explain it. Two, we need to understand science does have its limitations. Okay. Anyway, getting into that, I'm going to talk about the process of science. Now, let me tell you a phrase that I really, really hate, down deep to my boots. I hate the phrase, the scientific method. Okay? I'd like everyone to please write the scientific method in your notebook, or on whatever you're taking notes on. And then after you write the scientific method, I would like for you to cross that sucker out. Just boom, big X through it, big angry line through it. However you want to, let's kill the scientific method right here and right now, because there is no single one method that science uses to work. There's a lot of parts of science. Barrett's already mentioned one. He mentioned a hypothesis. Okay, that's definitely a part of how experimental science is done, or observational science. Can anybody raise your hand and think of other parts of how science works? I know hypothesis is the one that always sticks in people's minds. Anybody? Before someone who's doing science jumps straight into a hypothesis, is there usually something that happens before that, or things that happen after that? They usually have some kind of question that they're trying to answer, sure. Okay, what else? Okay, they come up with theory maybe eventually based on, observations and stuff. Well, I gave one away. Observation is part of science. Okay, what else? Okay. All right. Usually there's something that kicks that question off, like everybody giving you the look when you wear that one shirt. Okay? So here are some different pieces of science. Okay? Would y'all agree you've heard some of those? Okay? So, what the scientific method would lead you to believe is that there's a step 1, and then step 2, and then step 3, and step 4, until you get to step X, or Z, or whatever, and then you're done with science. In reality, science doesn't work like that. You walk up to any scientist doing actual legit research somewhere, and you say, so how do you use the scientific method? They're probably going to say, well, I don't. Okay? All of these are important parts, but let's say that you start off with an observation. Okay, the thing about your shirt. So I make an observation, hey, folks are checking me out. So maybe that observation will lead me to a question. Why are they checking me out? Does it have to do with this shirt? So then maybe I will go from there, and I will have some kind of hypothesis that will say, okay, maybe this shirt makes me look hot. So I could go from this down to this right here. After I have that hypothesis, I'm going to want to try and test it, right? Maybe I'm going to want to try and test it. Maybe I'm going to look through my closet and see if I have any other shirts that are kind of like that, or see if anybody else has a shirt like that and how they look in it. So that would fall under the heading of research. Maybe I'll research. Maybe I'll jump straight from my hypothesis to the experiment. I don't know. When I do my experiment by wearing that shirt on that particular day, I'm going to watch and see what other people do, which is what? No, I'm not analyzing just yet. I got to observe it first. And then maybe from my observations, I can go back and analyze it. Maybe my observations will lead me to revise my hypothesis. Maybe my observations will lead me to do more research, or possibly to do some more experimenting. Right? Maybe analyzing my data, instead of answering my question, maybe it will just make me come up with more. Do you see the problem here? It's not really a problem. It's just saying, hey, this is not a point A to point B to point C process. If I'm very, very lucky, then possibly my analysis might lead me to come to some kind of a conclusion. But usually that's not a stopping point, because usually, let's say that my conclusion is that one shirt that I have, is showing off just enough, chest cleavage or belly or whatever, that people are finding that alluring. Maybe it's going to lead me to ask the question, well, what if I had some other shirts that, showed off just how good my bod is looking? So that would lead to more questions. Or it would lead maybe to another hypothesis. You get me? So, instead of the scientific method, I want you to think in terms of the scientific process. And the big difference between the two is a scientific process is kind of like a wheel. Just keeps going round and round and round. There's not really one single starting point. There's not really one single ending point. It can go all over the place. But if you're doing it right, it never stops. It is a continual thing. Every one of you have been doing this since the day you were born. Since the day you were born and you were babies, and you start seeing blobs and things are talking to you, and you see colors and shapes. Babies are great scientists. They make observations, they ask questions, and then they get right to experimenting. They grab it, they put it in their mouth. Okay? They start experimenting with, if I make this face back at somebody, what kind of response am I going to get? And you still do this. You don't have to be in a science class to do science. You are all about asking questions about the world around you and then trying things to see what happens. Okay? Questions about that? Okay. So let's talk about some of these pieces in a little bit more depth. Let's start off with a hypothesis, right? Now, the textbook definition of hypothesis that everyone has always, fallen back on is a hypothesis is an, say it louder, educated guess. Okay? Anybody ever learned that a hypothesis is an educated guess? Here's why I don't like that definition. I'm educated, right? I went to college. I got a bachelor's degree. I did some post-grad work. Haven't quite got my master's, but maybe one of these days I'll get around to it. I know a lot about the world around me. I read a lot of books. I would say I am educated. Now, I walk outside and I see that the sky is looking kind of pink. Well, I'm educated. I'm going to guess that that pink sky is because of all of the unicorn parts in the atmosphere. They come out pink and fluffy. Now, that's my educated guess. Is that a hypothesis? You're shaking your head no. Why not? You think it is? Well, we'll do a quick poll right here, okay? Raise your hand real quick if you think that my unicorn fart theory is a hypothesis. Okay, I'm glad nobody did. So, what's wrong with that? I mean, it's a possible explanation for something I've observed, right? Going back a slide, though, what can't I do? Where can't I go from that?
Research.
I could maybe check on the internet and see if anybody has reported any studies of unicorn farts and meteorological effects. Maybe. I probably won't find much because, say again, Axel, where can I go from there? How can I experiment on unicorn farts if nobody's ever caught a unicorn? Or observed a unicorn, right? Narwhals don't count. They fart underwater anyway. So in order for a hypothesis to be useful, I've got to be able to test it. I've got to be able to experiment on it. Jot this down. Hypothesis is a testable if-then statement. Whoa, that was not where I was going with that at all. Let's try that again. It's testable. It's an if-then statement. What I mean by if-then statement, it's got two parts to it. It's got a, if I do blah, 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 then blah, blah, blah will happen. It's got a part that I control, and then it's got a part that I observe. Okay? Those two parts are called the independent variable and the dependent should all be writing this down. Now, I will tell you if this recording works well, then I'm going to be posting links to it in the Google Classroom page, so you should all be able to pull it up again. If you don't quite get everything down, don't panic about it. How many of you have heard, I know you've heard the word variable. How many of you have heard the term independent variable or dependent variable? Your hands coming up, that's good. Anybody tell me off the top of your head what the difference is between those? If not, we'll get there. Don't worry about it. Independent variable means what? The dependent variable means the independent variable. The clue to that is in the name, right? If it's dependent, that means it depends on something else. Very good. Okay, let's look at that in a little bit more light here. Let's look at the independent variable. The independent variable is what I change or manipulate. You see how I have underlined the letter I in the word independent? Because I am the one in control of that. I did something. I established the conditions under which I'm going to make observations. Now put the word manipulate down here. Okay? What does it mean to manipulate something? You know anybody who's a manipulator? Okay. What do they do? Okay, they guilt trip you. They try and influence your behavior by doing something. The word actually comes from the Latin root for hands. Okay? Now, none of y'all probably speak Latin, but I think some of y'all probably know a little bit of Spanish. Does anybody know what hands are in Spanish? Los manos. See? So, manipulate literally means get your hands on it. Okay? It's also sometimes called the manipulated variable for this very reason. It's what I change or manipulate. If I blank, so going back to your hypothesis, the if part is tied to the independent variable. If I do something. The dependent variable, like Gracie said, it depends on or responds to my independent variable. There. Okay? It's also sometimes called the responding variable. Okay? And it's going to be what I observe or measure or record. If I wear this really cute shirt, that's the independent. Then people will tell me how good I look. That's what I'm observing. That's what I'm trying to see happen. Trying to see if there's a response to what I independently did. Does that make sense? Okay, excellent. And again, if you don't quite get all this down, it is all going to be where you can watch it later, so I'm going to keep going. I don't want to rush anybody, but be more about sticking with me than worrying about getting down every word here. So, here's the definitions again for independent variable, in case you didn't quite get them down. Now, I've got on here an XY graph, because a lot of times in science, when you are collecting data, you want to be able to get a visual picture of it. You want to be able to look and see if a graph tells you an answer to your question. Okay? Namely, does this shirt make me look hot? Well, how can a graph do that? Well, because when you are graphing these out, it's traditional to put one of those two variables on the x-axis and to put the other one on the y-axis. Does anybody know rule of thumb for which one goes where? I'm going to show you a thing, and you're never going to forget this. The thing I'm going to show you is dry mix. Anybody ever heard that before? Yep. In my class? Excellent. Okay. Chex Mix. Not about, Nestle.
Dry has a B.
Yes, it does. It has a D and it has a Y. Which means, hey, the y-axis is for the dependent variable. What was another name for the dependent variable? You remember? Responding variable. What about mixed? It's got an X, and the I is for independent. What about the M? Excellent. Does that make sense? Okay. So if I ever say, hey, go graph your data, you don't ever have to say, well, how do I do that? What goes where? The thing that you change goes down here. The thing that you are measuring goes right here. Great. Okay. Let me see. I think we might have one or two more slides here. Maybe. I thought so. Let's talk about some other parts of a typical experimental design. Okay? One important thing is what's called the control group. When you have a legit, well-constructed experiment, you have something called a control. A control group is something where you don't change most of your conditions. You keep everything very, very ordinary. So, now this doesn't work well with the t-shirt thing, or with the shirt thing, because, if I was to say, if you were to have a control group, that would mean you come to school that day with no shirt on. And I don't want you doing that, okay? Let's change our metaphor then, and let's talk about plants. Let's say that you're trying to come up with, you're trying to test some different fertilizers on plants, see which kind of fertilizer works the best. So I'm going to get 3 sets of plants. In one set of plants, I'm going to give them fertilizer X, okay? Another set of plants, I'm going to give them fertilizer Y. What is my third set of plants for? I don't give them any fertilizer. Everything else is kept the same. I want to try and use the same kind of plants, give them the same amount of water, put them in the same amount of sunlight. But the big difference with my control group of plants is that they're not getting that independent variable. The reason I do that is because after I have been feeding these plants for long enough, I want to be able to see if the fertilizers actually made any difference. If I see that the plants in group X are a little bit taller than the ones in group Y, then maybe that will tell me that fertilizer X seems to work better than Y. But then when I look at my control group and I see that they're taller than all the other ones, what does that tell me? Yeah, that they actually are worse for the plant than just leaving it alone. See? But I wouldn't have known that if I didn't have my control group. Now, don't get a control group confused with what's called a constant. Okay? Constants are things that stay the same with everything I'm experimenting on, no matter if it's one of my control subjects or if it's one of my variable subjects. So, again, looking at the plants, I want to make sure all these plants are the same kind of plant. I want to be sure they've got all the same amount of soil. They get the same amount of water. They're grown in the same kind of pot. They're put in a room with the same temperature, same light levels. I want to keep everything else constant, everything else as close to the same as possible. Because if I don't, then maybe something that's different from one group to another is what's actually causing what I observed. We're going to look at some practice stuff here in just a little bit to help us identify some of these different variables and control groups and constants and stuff like that. So it's mostly some decent common sense stuff, but you're going to consider it against what you've been writing here. And hey, that's the hang tight. Let me give you a thing here. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can break my computer here. Starting up the webcam. Probably. Okay. So what we've got here is we've got some scenarios. We're going to look at the first one together, and then I will let you get into some smaller groups and see if you can figure out some of these other ones on your own. So here's the first one. It's January, and Haley, Sarah, and Becky are tired of having cold feet while waiting for the school bus to come in the morning. They decide to design an experiment to test the effectiveness of wool, cotton, and nylon as insulators. So they fill identical bottles with 200 milliliters of water at 100 degrees Celsius, place inside each sock. Then they take the temperatures of the water after 20 minutes. So what we have to try and identify here is what is our independent variable, what is our dependent variable, and what are some constants. So looking back at our definition of independent variable, the independent variable is the one that I change, the one that I manipulate, not the thing I'm measuring. So what's different from group to group to group here? Raise your hand if you think you know. Gracie, what do you think? Different types of sock. I absolutely agree with that. So under independent variable, we're going to put type of sock. Now, we might be specific and say the material the sock's made out of, because they're not testing like knee socks versus ankle socks versus no-shows or whatever. So somebody else, let's look at the dependent variable. What are they directly observing or measuring here? Raise your hand. Casey. The temperature of the water, absolutely. Very good. You agree? They're seeing if there is a relationship between what type of sock it is and what temperature the water will be after it's been sitting inside there for 20 minutes. So, the next part, are there any constants? What are some things that stay the same from trial to trial to trial? Raise your hand if you can tell me one. Okay? Okay? So the constants are the amount of water. Okay? Is there anything else? Okay. The starting temperature of the water. Is the same for all of them. Anybody see or think of any more there? Crazy. Okay. The time, it needs to be exactly 20 minutes for each one. There's one more that jumps right out at me. Somebody else raise your hand if you see it. Say again? Identical bottles. Okay? All right. Now, this is not something that's part of this question as written, but does this experiment have a control group? Yes or no? Who votes yes? Raise your hand. Who votes no? Raise your hand. Okay. Who's too scared to vote? Raise your hand. All right. No, it doesn't. So if it had a control, what would a control look like in this? I'll give you a hint. Look at all the things we wrote down for constants. All of those would be there. Now look at independent variable. That's not going to be there. So what would it look like? Bottle of water with 100 degrees, 200 milliliters of 100 degree water with no sock, right? Okay, very good. folks, we are just about out of time for today. This paper here is not homework. This paper is practice, and we will come back and we'll look at a few others. Tomorrow, I've got slated for you to start doing a lab. Okay? It's going to help with some of your thinking about experimental design, thinking about observation. So, come prepared to... I would not wear a dress tomorrow, guys, because you're probably going to be sitting on the floor at some point, and the lab's called Losing Your Marbles. So, can't wait for that tomorrow. Go ahead and put your stuff away for the day.